I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
Welcome to Deep Cuts, the podcast where we pick a topic and walk you through the ins, the outs, and the nitty-gritty, so you can appear like an interesting and idiosyncratic person at your next forced social function. Today's topic is...
Petrus Gonsalvus, the real-life Beauty and the Beast.
Who was Petrus Gonsalvus? Well, he was a gentleman of some standing in multiple European courts who suffered from hypertrichosis, a medical condition that causes hair to grow all over the human body. He is loosely the basis for the fable of Beauty and the Beast. However, he spent his life as an indentured servant, a sideshow freak, and a pseudo-slave to multiple noble families all across Europe. But at least there's a movie inspired by him. Act 1. The French movie looks great, but them Disney songs bang, broski. Petrus Gonsalvus, born Pedro Gonzalez in 1537, was a gentleman of the court of Henry II of France. He suffered from having hypertrichosis, which caused him to be known as the Wild Gentleman of Tenerife, or the Canarian Wolfman. Surprisingly, he lived an aristocratic life and had many exploits both in Italy and in France. For those not in the know, hypertrichosis, aka werewolf syndrome, is an affliction where hair grows all over the human body. There are two distinct types of the syndrome, localized and general. In previous generations, this condition could either yield a death sentence or a life being condemned to a sideshow freak. Papa Spicy, are you familiar with this term, hypertrichosis?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I really didn't know anything about this story as we get into it. This is kind of the first I'm hearing about it. But of course, there are many people, mostly in the kind of like early 1900s to like 1940s, that were, relatively well-known people that were like circus sideshow freaks that had hypertrichosis. I think a lot of people are familiar with the look of them. When you see like old footage of circuses from the 1930s and there's like the amazing Wolfman, that's just exactly what this is.
I suppose this is as good a time as any to transition into, do you currently feel like a sideshow freak? Come, ladies and gentlemen, and see the one and only Papa Spicy, who has one functioning leg.
The amazing one-legged Papa Spicy. Yeah, I don't know if anybody would pay money to see me in an exhibit. I feel like this happens from time to time. There's been moments throughout the history of the show where something's come up, or for some reason, we had to take a couple of weeks off the show. But I feel like we're really bad at like communicating that when it happens. We'll mention it in our Facebook group and our Discord server to the, maybe like 5,000 listeners that are collectively in those two spaces. But I always wonder what other listeners think when we just disappear for like 3 weeks, because we always just suck at like telling people why we're gone. And it's for a very specific, really stupid, obsessive reason, which is that the episode titles of our show have the number of the episode in them. They're each a case file. So every episode of the show is case file, 136. And right now, those are aligned with the actual episode numbers of the podcast. So episode 136 is case file 136. If we were to ever like post a little 30-second thing being like, hey, just to let you know, we're going on hiatus because Spandrew fell down a fucking mountain and broke his body, it would throw off the alignment of our episode numbers. And then case file 136 would be episode 137.
Papa Spicy, I feel like you're burying the lead. I feel like you should not be explaining the episode titling scheme and more say, look, I'll set you up. Spandrew, did anything happen to you while you were in Europe that might have caused you great physical harm and sent you to the hospital and therefore delayed our posting of episodes?
Yes, as a matter of fact, now that you mention it, I have been in Europe for the past month, and, we were still recording the show. Everything was still on track. I brought my equipment. I've done it before on road trips, on flights to other countries. I bring my equipment. We keep the show going. This time, however, I was in Switzerland and we were hiking up in the Alps. And at some point on this hike, I slipped and slid down a very steep hill and broke my leg very badly. It can't be understated how bad I broke my leg. You know, it's funny because I was looking back through my text messages, and the way that I told you was, it was literally on the day we were supposed to record. We were going to record later on, and actually we were heading back to the hotel thing to record. We were leaving, and I was going back to this place to record. And on the way home is when this happened. And then I texted you, and I have a vague memory of this. I don't fully remember this, but I kind of remembered it. And I went back and looked, and this is how I told you. I sent you a text, and I said, Papa Pricey broke his leg and is on the way to the hospital, so obviously we can't record today, just FYI, with like half of those words misspelled. And it's funny because I didn't like text you this like hours after this happened or like the next morning or something like that. I texted this to you while I was in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And I was high out of my mind when I sent you this text. On whatever medication they gave me in the ambulance, like I got in the ambulance, they injected me with something very powerful, which I actually think might have been ketamine. And I texted this to you. And I don't have a memory of it specifically. I have a memory of the fact that I did it. I had the sense that I had told you, mostly because I think in my text message history, you know, you're asking me about it and things like that. But I don't actually have a specific memory of ever sending you this text. I had just broken my leg like maybe 15 minutes ago whenever I texted you that.
So basically, just to set the scene, you're in like a Swiss ambulance being taken to a hospital where they have socialized medicine and you're probably going to actually get taken care of. And your foot is like full, like Anton Yelchin in Green Room, just like flopping around. And then you're like, I guess I'll just text old Davy boy, see what's going on. By the way, something came up.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the first two things I did was text that to you. No, it was just that. I just texted you. I also texted my job, but I think I didn't do that until I had already gone to the hospital, already had the surgery, already woke up from the surgery, and then I texted my job to tell them, like, I'm fucked. That's the thing is, like, when this happened, as I'm laying there, I fell, I broke my leg, I'm sitting there, people are gathering around me, people start calling emergency lines, they're trying to help me up into like a golf cart and all this stuff like that. The things that are running through my mind are two things. Number one is like, fuck, now we're going to not be able to record the show and we're going to miss more episodes. Like that's the first thing that goes in my mind. And then the other thing that's going in my mind is like, this is just going to be a pain in the ass. I'm going to have to be like lifted down somewhere with like a fucking helicopter or something. And then I'm going to have to go into a hospital and they're going to have to like do a surgery on me. This is going to take forever. Like that was what I was thinking. I was thinking of nothing else other than just what a hassle this was going to be. Like that was immediately the thing that went through my mind. But yeah, I slipped and broke my ankle, and it wasn't the loosely hanging like Green Room thing. It was, I slip and I looked down as I slipped. So I saw what happened. Like I visually saw what happened. And afterward, when I was like laying there and stuff like that, my wife and also a couple of these other strangers, these German people, were kind of like being like, oh, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe you just sprained it or something like that. And I was like, no, it's not sprained. Because whenever I slipped, I looked down and saw it happen. And I just saw my foot at the ankle just go.
No.
I saw my foot just go sideways. It was just like, goop. And so when they were saying, they're kind of being hopeful, and they're like, maybe it's just sprained. I was like, nah, she's bad, baby. She's bad. And it really was. It was bent very far to the side. I dislocated 3 bones. I fractured several bones. And I had to have like a 4-hour surgery to repair it. And they put a bunch of plates and screws into my ankle. It was apparently just a very bad break that took a long time to fix. And it's in Switzerland. So I was taken to this hospital that's like a trauma center where they helicopter in people who have like gotten hurt in ski accidents. So I happened to go to a very good hospital for fixing fucked up injuries. So they were able to do it very well, but it was apparently like a very severe break.
You're in like the emergency room and the doctor comes out and he's like, oh, you don't have any puncture wounds in your lungs? You didn't fall on top of a ski? No, you're good? Oh, it's just a broken... Oh, wow, your foot is fucked. Wow, yeah, it's fucked. We fix for you. I don't know what accent this is.
That's kind of it, because it's German, but it's like Swiss German, so it's slightly modified. It's almost kind of mixed with French a little bit. So it is like an interesting accent that isn't exactly German. That kind of is what it was. The surgeon who fixed my ankle, he was like kind of an eccentric guy. And he had like that kind of interesting Swiss German accent. He looked almost exactly like, what is his name? Edward Bagley Jr. He looked exactly like that guy. The way you acted was kind of spot on. He was just like, hopping around the room being like, oh, I'm going to fix your foot now.
Oh, your femur is out. We just gotta tuck this back in. Bad femur, back into the flesh sack.
This is not a joke. This is just accurate. Yeah, they did the surgery and they said something about something being upside down. But yeah, that's why we were gone. On the day that we were supposed to be recording this episode, I was freaking having a surgery done on me. And all the other days, I was just laying in a hospital bed in a Swiss hospital room, just like not knowing what was going on, not being able to talk to anybody, having a bunch of nurses just like wheel me to the bathroom and ask me if I pooped or not. It was a wild week.
Well, on that note, I suppose we should get back to this episode. Thanks, everybody, for allowing us that dalliance, because we have not had much time to catch up. So one of the people we're going to end up talking about today is a performer named Julia Pastrana, who was arguably the most famous person afflicted with hypertrichosis in the 18 and 1900s. Julia was a performer and a singer during the 19th century. She was an indigenous woman from Mexico who was born in 1834, and we think maybe she was born in the state of Sinaloa. We're not actually quite sure because records aren't so great. Julia had hypertrichosis, but also had a few other genetic abnormalities where her ears were abnormally large and her teeth were irregular and her nose and cheeks were also enlarged. She suffered from what they call gingival hyperplasia, which thickened both her gums and her lips. These are one is a drawing and then the other one's a photo of her. Do you want to describe these images?
Well, first of all, they did her dirty with this painting. Obviously she has these genetic maladies that make her look not similar to the conventional idea of what a person looks like. There's no way to sugarcoat that. But the painting of her is just like, she's a fucking freak of nature. They go way over the top and make it such a caricature. The actual photo of her is a lot more subdued. She's a woman wearing this sort of like South American inspired dress, kind of like a South American pattern vibe to it. Her face is covered in hair, like really thick black hair. She's got like pretty pronounced lips that kind of like pucker, and then like a very low set brow that does give her sort of a Cro-Magnon look, but not as exaggerated as the illustration.
No, it's not as exaggerated. I mean, obviously that image is like a poster made to convince people to come see her in a sideshow attraction, right? But even so, she does look in real life fairly extreme, which has got to be a very singular and probably lonely experience to live through, right?
Yeah.
Let's read from her wiki page here, if you wouldn't mind, Spander.
Multiple versions of Pastrana's early life exist. Literature by those who managed the freak shows she appeared in described her as belonging to a Native American tribe called Root Diggers. Sounds like a racial slur. Whose members were similar to apes and lived in caves. In this version, it is said that a woman identified only as Mrs. Espinoza was kidnapped by the tribe and held in a cave and took Pastrana with her when she was able to escape. In another version, which is based on the words of indigenous villagers in Acaroni, Mexico, Pastrana was a local girl whom they referred to as Wolf Woman. In this version, Pastrana lived with her mother until her mother passed away, after which her uncle sold her to the circus. Both accounts claim that at some point she lived in the home of Pedro Sanchez, the then governor of Sinaloa, and left the home in 1854. According to Ireneo Paz, Francisco Sepulveda, a customs official in Mazatlan, purchased Pastrana and brought her to the United States. At first, Pastrana performed under the management of J.W. Beach, but in 1854 she eloped with Theodore Lint, marrying him in Baltimore, Maryland. Lint took over her management and they toured through the US and Europe. Pastrana was advertised as a hybrid between an animal and a human and worked in sideshows and freak shows under the stage names The Baboon Lady, The Dog-Faced Woman, The Hairy Woman, The Ape-Faced Woman, The Ape Woman, The Bear Woman, and The Nondescript. During her performance, she demonstrated her intelligence and talent singing, dancing, and interacting with the audience. During a tour in Moscow, Pastrana gave birth to a son with features similar to her own. The child survived only 3 days, and Pastrana died of postpartum complications 5 days later.
She died at the age of 25.
I mean, first of all, Jesus Christ, that's fucking sad and dark. But also, man, I mean, it's like bad enough to be, you know, afflicted with these maladies and the social ramifications that come along with that, the way that you're obviously treated, the lack of opportunities you probably have, the fact that there's, you know, no real job you can get aside from probably just like the worst of manual labor or working as basically a freak show exhibit in some kind of entertainment attraction. But on top of that, just the sheer number of nicknames. Like, it's bad enough that somebody's like, oh, it's the Baboon Lady. That probably doesn't feel good. But then they keep having more nicknames. And it's like, okay, guys, I get it. I'm the Baboon Lady. I'm the Dog-Faced Woman. You're too inspired to come up with these names. Like, please. This is like the worst version of being somebody's muse ever. Like, you keep having new ideas for horrible nicknames for me. Like, we just need the one.
Yeah, like, I get it, you're gonna bully me, and I'm gonna make money off of you bullying me, but can we just bully me, like, the normal amount? Does it have to be, like, everybody gets excited about it?
You guys are doing the this guy looks like version of fucking nicknaming a freak show exhibit in the 1800s. Like, calm down.
I mean, look, the beginning of her story, regardless of which one is true, or if there's a third option that's, you know, more accurate of, you know, being sold to the US and living as a freak is, you know, it's horrible. But then to be able to parlay that into a career as a performer and singing and dancing and doing crowd work and meeting someone and falling in love, and then utilizing this notoriety in order to progress your life and move in a more substantial, you know, means, and getting all the way to like Russia in the 1800s, that's insane, right? Like, most people don't have the gall to get on a boat and travel for 3 months, you know? Like, that's a lot of bravery, right? And then to have it all end in this horrific, depressing episode of, you know, she's going to have a child and the child dies, and then the complications from childbirth, which is also probably, again, related to the fact that the doctors in Russia aren't taking very good care of her because she's a quote-unquote, like, werewolf girl. You know?
And that's kind of the story with all these things, right? Like, we did the episode about the lobster boy, Grady whatever. I forget what his name is, Grady something. And, you know, it was the same thing. This, like, dude that is just, like, a raging alcoholic and just has, like, these deep-seated mental illness issues, and then he has this whole family and they also have all these mental illness issues, and then it winds up with him fucking murdering multiple people and then people murdering him, and it's all because, you know, these are people with disabilities that need like constant medical intervention and care. And even to the degree that wasn't as advanced back in the late 1800s as it is now, like, obviously we've advanced far more in being able to care for disabled people. It still existed then to a certain level, and these are the type of people that need constant care. But instead, by the sheer nature of what they are and what they're doing, it's like the things that you need medical help for are the things that we need to exploit to make money in these sideshow attractions. So not only are you not going to like get medical care or any kind of help for these things, but also we're going to kind of jab you with a stick and make these things worse and more exaggerated. And these stories tend to end with somebody dying very young or in a really horrific way because, you know, there's a short half-life for a sideshow freak whose entire job is just exploiting their own disability.
Let's read a little bit about what happened to her after she passed, because her remains basically ended up traveling the world in a not exactly respectful fashion. So let's read this section from her wiki.
Oh, God. For over 100 years, the bodies of Pastrana and her son were displayed around the world in museums, circuses, and amusement parks. They appeared in Norway in 1921 and toured the U.S. as late as 1972. Later that year, a tour of Sweden drew considerable public opposition, leading to the bodies being withdrawn from public view. Vandals broke into the storage facility in August of 1976 and damaged the baby's body. The remains were consumed by mice. Julia's preserved body was stolen in 1979, but stored at the Oslo Forensic Institute after the body was reported to police but not identified. It was identified in 1990 and for many years rested in a sealed coffin at the Department of Anatomy, Oslo University. In 1994, the Norway Parliament recommended burying her remains, but the Minister of Sciences decided to keep them so scientists could perform research. A special permit was required to gain access to her remains. Okay, so fuck this.
Fuck this,
like,
right?
We've talked in depth about the idea of circus freaks. Like, we discussed that pretty thoroughly in the Grady Stiles. Is that his name?
Let me double check, but that sounds pretty accurate.
Grady Stiles is either his name or it's like a name of one of the members of NSYNC, and I'm confusing them.
Grady Franklin Stiles Jr., baby.
Oh, yeah. We talked about it in depth on there, and I know we've talked about the ethics around circus freaks in other episodes as well. I know we have. It's a conversation we've had multiple times. So, you know, the ethics of it have been thoroughly sort of interrogated on this show, and everybody knows what we think about it. And also, it's pretty self-evident. It's pretty common sense. It's like, this is fucked up, and it's good that this doesn't really happen anymore. And while there was a period where people who were generating an income from this were sort of like unfairly robbed of their ability to generate an income of it as it became more frowned upon. After that transitionary phase, I think we can all agree that it's ultimately better that we don't go to circuses and like laugh at people with disabilities. Like, that's just like not cool. But at least to a certain extent, you can say, oh, this person consented to this. Like, they got into this line of work. They're in some way willingly doing this, although that can be debated. And you could say, like, no, they're not willingly doing it. They're doing it because they're fucking broke and they have no other way of generating money. And they're just kind of like allowing this humiliating process to be inflicted on them. But this is just beyond the pale. This is like the utter desecration of somebody's body after they've died. Like, no amount of respect or dignity to this woman and her child after death. They're just like, this person died. She should have been buried. But they took her body and they fucking displayed it across the world as an exhibit.
With such little care that mice got into it and ate her baby's fetus and nobody gave a shit.
And that's the worst part. Insult to injury or fucking injury to injury. I don't even know. Or insult to insult. It's one of those. But they do this. They desecrate this woman's and her child's body. And then they just allow her child to be eaten by mice. Like, that is the most vile thing I can even think of right now.
Well, get ready, because we're about to get even more vile, baby. So this episode, we're going kind of in reverse chronology, right? Like, she was kind of the 19th century standard bearer or key example of somebody with hypertrichosis. But going back further, we're going to talk about the main subject of today's episode, Petrus Gonsalvus. So Petrus Gonsalvus, as a 10-year-old boy, was kidnapped from the Canary Islands and brought to the court of Henry II in France. He was taken to the court and kept in a cage. The king wanted to, quote unquote, civilize him and taught him multiple languages and made him go to school. And basically his entire life was just like a joke, where like initially when they brought him there, he was freaking the fuck out because he's a 10-year-old, he's crying, he's in a goddamn cage, and he also has hair over his body, so they think he's some sort of dog.
Yeah, they're
animal.
like, oh, look at him, he's feral. It's like, no, he's fucking freaking out because you kidnapped him and trafficked him. He's a fucking little kid.
Exactly. He's a little kid that you trafficked. And yet, when they finally figured out that he did speak and they, we were able to communicate with him, they taught him multiple languages. And he became something of it's a strange thing to call him a scholar, because he wasn't really a scholar, because he was like being taught ironically, which is such a weird thing. Like, I guess you could be a scholar, but he wasn't. Like, he was a guy who spoke a bunch of different languages, and basically his entire life was as a prop in these various courts across
There's like,
Europe.
hey, Petrus, come over here. Do the thing. Watch this, do the thing. And he's like, okay. Well, I actually realized that if you just actually replace the sodium molecule in this formula, it actually solves cold fusion, and we can have perpetual energy with no cost forever. It'll solve all the world's hunger and living problems. Did you see that? He's got hair on his face and he's saying that? That was fucking funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild, right? It's wild that you would have this level of inhumanity, and yet this isn't even like the worst thing that happened to people during this time period. In the 1500s, this is like, oh man, yeah, he was like publicly shamed and made to be a fucking court jester ostensibly, but like slavery is rampant. So they teach him all these different languages, they send him to school, and then in 1559, Henry II dies.
Before we move on to that, the other thing I wanted to say before I did that bit was just that it almost kind of reminds me of, I mean, obviously this is like way crueler and more openly illegal. I mean, maybe not illegal then, but by today's standards, kidnapping a child. But it kind of reminds me of what we talked about in the past with outsider artists, where there's almost this paradigm where there's these people that, you know, they typically have some kind of either neurological disability or some kind of handicap, and they create some kind of art that's sort of like filtered through that unskilled, sort of like non-formalist view of the world. And then there are these people, these sort of like pretentious, hipstery art snobs that form these like fascinations around these people.
Hey man, I'm right here.
That can feel sometimes weirdly exploitative and kind of creepy and like borderline abusive, where, you know, I'm repeating things I've said already, but, you know, the Daniel Johnston and the way that his life and career transpired, where like in the last 10, 15 years of his life and career, he was this severely disabled man who clearly, you know, has some kind of mental disability, but also, you know, he had developed this like really aggressive Parkinson's disease, and he was like very physically disabled as well as neurologically disabled. And, you know, he was trotted around and people would bring him out. And I saw Daniel Johnston in concert at the Greek Theater in 2015. And it was like one of the last shows he ever did. And while I really just appreciated being able to see him, you know, before he passed away, it was also just kind of like sad to watch, where you have this man who's just like struggling to survive, just like wheeled out, and it's like, all right, play your little songs. And it kind of reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah, it does kind of. But I guess the difference being that like there's an inherent otherness that's being exploited in Petrus Gonsalvus, and he's not a willing participant in that. Like towards the end was Daniel Johnston? No, he probably wasn't. But for the majority of his life, that's what he wanted.
Maybe
right?
In that sense, Daniel Johnston is a bad example, and a better example is somebody like Wesley Willis, who was a homeless man who was schizophrenic, who performed on the streets because he was homeless and needed food. And then a similar fan base and fascination circled around him. And it was like, you know, once again, people who were feeding a mental illness in order to get this music out of him. And I don't know if he was ever fully really aware of what was happening to him whenever he was brought in and had albums produced. He was a deeply mentally ill man. I don't know if he ever fully was able to consent to much of what happened to him, but it was a lot of people who were like, I think in their minds, their heart was in the right place of like, oh, there's this guy, he's homeless, he's in need, he makes this really interesting, fascinating music, let's get him to record an album and maybe we can make some money for him or whatever. Like, to a certain extent, the heart is in the right place, but also just like deeply exploitative. And, you know, it's this like Ouroboros of like, the only way you can get this music out of him that you cherish is by feeding his mental illness. Because in reality, the real solution for him would be to get him some kind of medical intervention and get him on some kind of medication. And probably his music would not have had that quality to it that everybody loved so much if he was actually getting real help, you know?
Yeah. Well, the story of Petrus Gonsalvus is about to get a hell of a lot darker. So after King Henry II dies in 1559, his wife, Catherine Medici, marries off Petrus for her own pleasure. She's just like, let's see if he can fuck. And like, she finds a young woman also named Catherine who like worked in their castle or whatever, just like a peasant woman, and says, you're gonna get married to her. And she forces this young woman to marry Petrus Gonsalvus.
Petrus is like, actually, she's not my type.
He's just like, eh. But this is a little painting of the two of them and a portrait of him. What do you think of these two paintings?
So we saw a photograph and then a painting of Miss Julia Pastrana, and I talked in depth about that. So that being said, considering that we only have paintings of Petrus, I can't trust these. I've seen how dirty they've done Julia Pastrana. So in this painting, this is like almost directly, obviously the inspiration for, Lon Chaney Jr.'s The Wolfman. Like, cause it looks exactly like that. Like, picture the Wolfman, and that's what he looks like. But I also can't allow myself to believe that this is really what he looked like and that they probably were exaggerating.
Yeah, I hope they were exaggerating too. However, these paintings look more in line with what hypertrichosis patients typically exhibit in terms of symptoms.
But yeah, it's like Wolfman in medieval times. It's like Wolfman meets King Arthur or something.
So they end up having 6 or 7 kids.
And also the second painting of him with his wife is kind of funny because his wife, she just looks like she's disassociating. Like she's not there. And it's funny that the painter captured that. He captured her disassociating. And Petrus just looks like, fuck all of this. She looks like she's going somewhere else in her mind to try to escape the reality that she's in. And he just looks like, fuck all of you. He looks so pissed off.
So they get married. They have 6 or 7 children. 4 of their children end up having hypertrichosis. And we've got paintings of their son, Henry, and their daughters, Madeline and Antonietta, which we'll talk about in a second. And basically the kind of trajectory of their lives are that they're kind of put on display and taken on a tour across Europe, going from European court to European court, basically doing the freak show thing, but doing it at this crazy high level where they're kind of existing as props for kings and queens over European nations in the 1500s and 1600s.
Now, there's an interesting thing here. Like, as you just said, we have the paintings of their children, right? And one of them is a portrait that's sort of from the shoulders up of Antoinetta. And, she's a child that has the fur all over her face. And then there's a painting of, the first one is Henry. That was the one I just described. I didn't realize the name was above it. And then there's a second one, which is more of a kind of like full bust portrait. So it's like from the stomach up, or from the bottom of the chest up. And he's holding up like a little sheet of paper. I don't really know what that's about. But once again, it's just a little kid that has fur all over their face. That's Antonetta. And then a full body portrait of Madeline wearing like a dress. Now, an interesting thing, which I actually just learned after visiting a medieval castle in Germany and going on a tour, is these paintings, the way that they did these was there would be a painter who was kind of the equivalent of like a family photographer. Like if you wanted to have pictures taken of your family or whatever, and you hire them and they come out and you go out to a park or something like that. Or if you're doing it for like an engagement or whatever, or a birth announcement or whatever. And they would have these painters that would come around, and they had pre-painted paintings of just the bodies of children, because it was really hard to get children to sit still and be painted. So what they would do is they would just have paintings of children's bodies, and then they would come and then you would pick out the painting and then they would just paint the head on.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I can tell that that's what these are. These are pre-painted bodies that they just added the faces to, which, just imagining that scenario of like the painter comes out and he's like, all right, I've got these pre-painted canvases, just choose your ones and we'll get, we'll start the painting. And they choose the bodies or whatever. And they're like, all right. And then, he starts painting and he's like, okay. All right. That's not what I was expecting, but let's do it. Because you can see on their hands don't have fur on them.
Yeah, that's a good call. I had not noticed that, but you're totally right. That's absolutely what this is. So basically, this family kind of ends up spending most of their lives touring Europe, and then eventually the children end up getting sold off to the various different courts all around Europe. And Petrus and Catherine end up settling in Italy, and Catherine dies in 1623, and this is the best / most eerie part of the story. Nobody knows what happened to Petrus.
Wow.
I hope that he escaped, lived free, and lived a last act of his life away from this bullshit.
I mean, he's still alive today.
That's what I hope, man. I hope he's invented a time travel device and was able to come to the present. He's out there with an iPhone somewhere.
That's when you know you're in the future, is when you have an iPhone. Whoa, that guy, he's here now. He's in the present. He has an iPhone. I wasn't quite sure at first. I was like, maybe he's still in the past. But then I saw the iPhone.
That bitch is in the present. But yeah, this episode is about kind of these two specific people that have a similar medical condition separated by hundreds of years, and both who were afflicted by the same level of humanity's inhumanity and cruelty to our own. And both cases are hyper disturbing and depressing and sad and also very fascinating. And this story just kind of serves as a reminder, it's something of a pat point to make, but maybe we shouldn't judge people by the way they look. I don't think it's a point that has yet been solved by humanity. I think we love to judge and be revolted by things that don't look the way we preconceive them to be. And these stories are something of a fascination for me. And otherness, I think, is something of a fascination for me. And both Julia and Petrus are fascinating figures. And I wanted to talk about them with Spappa Spicy 3 weeks ago. And then that bitch is so clumsy, he fell down.
Yep. Even if you do judge people by the way they look, maybe just keep it as an inside thought. Maybe don't kidnap them and force them to live out a weird, unconsensual performance art for your entertainment life.
I agree.
Or don't create a weird, shadowy organization with a mission plan to systematically destroy all of them and make their lives illegal in the United States by the year 2025. Well,
on that note, I'm Dave Baker.
And I'm Spandrew Spice.
This has been Deep Cuts. If you'd like to find me online, you can do so at heydavebaker.com. You can also find my comics, Halloween Boy and Mary Tyler Moorhawk, and all kinds of other things on the interwebs and or wherever you get your books. Spandrew Spice. Where can people find you?
You can find me laid up in a bed with my foot up on a stack of pillows, which is what I'm doing right now. It's the first time I've ever recorded the show just from a bed. My microphone is just propped up on a little tripod in the bed with me right now, which worked surprisingly well for this recording. But you can't find me on social media. But if you want to pay your respects to the dear beloved Proper Pricey, who, at least at the end of the day, I made it out a little bit better than him. You can find his book, Deadbolt AI Private Eye, by going to dapricerights.com, picking up that book. You can follow us on social media by going to Facebook and searching Deep Cuts Podcast. You can join our Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group where we talk about the show and make memes. You can join our Discord server, bit.ly.com/deepcutsdiscord, where we talk about the show, make memes, play games, and other cool stuff. Here's the thing. My job requires long stints of extreme mental focus. And so frequently I try to blow off steam. And one of the things that I tend to do is just jump into the Discord and just talk to people for a good solid 5 minutes. So if you want direct access to being able to talk to me, the best thing you can do is just join the Discord. Because for better or worse, that's what I'm doing. You can follow us on Instagram at DeepCutsPod. You can follow us on TikTok at Mystery Treehouse. You can follow me on TikTok at Deadboy Detective. And you can follow my guidance and wear shoes with better soles on them when you're up in the mountains. Cuts is a production by Boy Genius Media. If you'd like to find this show and others like it, please visit boygeniusmedia.com or deepcutspod.com.
If you want to join in on post-episode discussions, please join the Deep Cuts Podcast Facebook group. Finally, subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional video content.